The evening was calm, and the streets were quiet. The sun had dipped below the horizon hours ago, leaving behind a soft glow from the streetlights that lined the roads. Marcus Thompson sat behind the wheel of his sleek silver sedan, humming along to the smooth jazz playing on the radio. He had just wrapped up an important meeting at work and was looking forward to getting home to relax. Life had been busy lately, but Marcus had always prided himself on staying composed no matter the situation. As he drove through the suburban neighborhood, everything seemed normal. The houses were dark, their occupants likely settling in for the night. Marcus kept his speed steady, mindful of the limit signs posted along the road. But then, without warning, he noticed a flicker of red and blue lights flashing in his rearview mirror. His heart sank slightly as he realized what was happening. A police car was pulling him over. Marcus wasn't surprised. He'd been pulled over before, often for reasons that felt questionable at best. It happened far too frequently for someone who followed all the rules, paid attention to the road, and took pride in being cautious. Still, he reminded himself to stay calm. "It's probably nothing," he muttered under his breath, though deep down he knew better. He signaled and eased, his car onto the shoulder of the road, coming to a smooth stop. Turning off the engine, he rolled down his window and waited patiently. In the side mirror, he watched as the officer stepped out of the patrol car. The man moved with an air of authority, his boots clicking against the pavement as he approached. Marcus glanced back at the dashboard clock. It was nearly 10 p.m., late enough that most people would be indoors by now. The officer leaned down toward the open window, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Marcus squinted slightly as the light hit his face. "License and registration, please," the officer said curtly, his voice clipped and cold. Marcus nodded politely, reaching into his glove compartment for the documents. As he handed them over, he couldn't help but notice the way the officer studied him, not just his ID, but him. There was something in the officer's gaze that made Marcus uneasy, like he was sizing him up, judging him before even speaking again. "Do you know why I pulled you over tonight?" the officer asked after a pause. His tone carried an edge, almost accusatory. Marcus hesitated for a moment, unsure how to respond. He hadn't been speeding, he was certain of it. He hadn't run any stop signs or broken any traffic laws. Yet here he was, sitting in the driver's seat, feeling the weight of scrutiny pressing down on him. "I'm not sure, officer," Marcus replied calmly, choosing his words carefully. "I don't believe I've done anything wrong. Was there a specific issue?" The officer didn't answer right away. Instead, he flipped through Marcus's license and registration, frowning as if searching for something incriminating. Finally, he looked up, his expression hardening. "You were going 15 miles over the speed limit back there," he said firmly, pointing vaguely in the direction they'd come from. Marcus blinked in disbelief. 15 miles over? That couldn't be true. He'd been driving well within the limit, keeping pace with the flow of traffic earlier when there were other cars around. Now the road was empty, and he'd been especially careful. "I'm sorry, officer, but I don't think that's accurate," he said, maintaining his composure. "I've been watching my speed closely." The officer's jaw tightened. "Are you calling me a liar?" he shot back, his voice rising slightly. The accusation hung in the air between them, sharp and unexpected. Marcus felt a knot form in his stomach. This wasn't going the way he'd hoped. "No, sir," Marcus replied quickly, holding up a hand in a gesture of peace. "I'm simply saying that I don't recall exceeding the speed limit. If there's been some misunderstanding—" "There's no misunderstanding," the officer interrupted sharply. "Now, where are you coming from tonight?" Marcus hesitated. Why did it matter where he was coming from? He'd been at a professional meeting, discussing policies and procedures for the organization he worked with. Nothing about his evening warranted suspicion. Still, he answered truthfully. "I was at a work meeting downtown. I'm heading home now." "And this car," the officer pressed, tapping the roof of the sedan with his flashlight. "Is it yours?" "Yes, it's mine," Marcus said, trying to keep his frustration in check. "I purchased it last year." The officer didn't seem satisfied. He circled the vehicle slowly, inspecting it as if expecting to find something amiss. When he returned, to the driver's side window, his demeanor had shifted. Gone was any pretense of professionalism. His questions became more pointed, his tone dripping with disdain. "You live around here?" he asked, gesturing vaguely to the neighborhood. "No, I live a few towns over," Marcus explained. "But I take this route home sometimes, it's quieter." The officer snorted, shaking his head. "Quicker, you mean? People like you always try to cut corners." Marcus froze. The comment stung, not because it was particularly creative or cruel, but because it was so familiar. He'd heard variations of it throughout his life, in stores, at restaurants, even in boardrooms. It was the kind of remark meant to remind him of his place, to suggest that he didn't belong. And yet, here it was again, delivered casually by a man sworn to protect and serve. "People like me?" Marcus repeated softly, his voice steady despite the anger bubbling beneath the surface. "What does that mean exactly?" The officer ignored the question, instead asking another one. "What do you do for work?" "I'm in law enforcement," Marcus said plainly. It wasn't entirely untrue. He worked closely with police departments, though he doubted this officer would understand the specifics. He figured it might lend him some credibility, perhaps ease the tension. But the response only made things worse. The officer scoffed, clearly unconvinced. "Law enforcement, right, and I'm the mayor. Look, buddy, don't waste my time with stories, just tell me the truth." Marcus clenched his fists briefly before releasing them. He wanted to argue, to demand respect, but he knew it wouldn't help. Arguing with someone like this officer rarely ended well, so instead he stayed silent, letting the man rant while silently reminding himself that this encounter wouldn't define his night or his life. As the minutes ticked by, the officer grew increasingly agitated. He scribbled something on his notepad, muttering under his breath. Then, without explanation, he ordered Marcus to step out of the car. "Let's go." "Out of the vehicle." Marcus complied, knowing resistance would only escalate the situation. As he stood on the roadside, hands raised slightly to show he posed no threat, he locked eyes with the officer. For a brief moment he considered revealing his true identity, the fact that he was far more than just a random citizen pulled over for a bogus speeding violation. But he decided against it. Let the man dig his own hole, he thought. Let him see for himself. Little did either of them know, this traffic stop was about to become much bigger than either of them could have imagined. The cool night air hit Marcus as he stepped out of his car, the sound of gravel crunching under his shoes. The officer's flashlight beam danced across his face, momentarily blinding him before moving down to inspect his hands. Marcus kept them, steady, palms open and slightly raised, a gesture of cooperation. He could feel the tension in the air growing thicker with each passing second. The officer, whose nameplate read Collins, circled around him slowly, his boots scraping against the asphalt. It was clear that Collins wasn't just conducting a routine check anymore. This felt personal. "You seem pretty calm for someone who got caught speeding," Collins remarked, his tone laced with sarcasm. His voice carried an edge, like he was daring Marcus to slip up or show some sign of defiance. Marcus swallowed, hard but kept his expression neutral. He'd been in situations like this before, situations where authority figures tried to provoke a reaction, but he also knew how quickly things could escalate if he let his emotions get the better of him. "Already told you, officer," Marcus said evenly. "I don't believe I was speeding. If there's been a mistake, I'm happy to clarify." Collins stopped circling and stood directly in front of Marcus, his posture rigid. "A mistake? Nah, no mistake here. You were flying down that road like you owned it." He leaned in closer, his breath warm and tinged with coffee. "People like you always think they're above the rules." Marcus blinked, taken aback by the comment. "People like me," he echoed, keeping his voice low and controlled. "What exactly do you mean by that?" Collins smirked, clearly enjoying the power dynamic he'd created. "You know what I mean. Suit and tie, fancy car. You think flashing those credentials makes you untouchable? Newsflash. It doesn't work on me. Marcus exhaled sharply through his nose, biting back the retort that threatened to spill out. He wanted to point out the hypocrisy in Collins's words, the assumption that owning a nice car or dressing well somehow equated to arrogance or entitlement. But he held his tongue. Arguing wouldn't solve anything. It would only give Collins more ammunition to use against him. Instead, he focused on staying composed, repeating a silent mantra in his head. Stay calm. Stay calm. But Collins wasn't done. He took another step forward, invading Marcus's personal space. And what about this law enforcement gig you mentioned earlier? What is that supposed to mean, huh? You trying to pull one over on me? Marcus hesitated for a split second. Should he reveal who he really was? Would it even matter at this point? Part of him wanted to see the look on Collins's face when he found out he'd just antagonized someone high up in the system. But another part of him, the strategic part, knew that revealing his position too soon might undermine the larger lesson he hoped Collins would eventually learn. So instead, he chose his words carefully. I didn't say I was active duty, Marcus replied calmly. I consult with departments on policy reform, that's all. Collins laughed, a sharp bark of disbelief. Policy reform? Oh, sure, because we need you telling us how to do our jobs. He shook his head, muttering something under his breath that Marcus couldn't quite catch. Then, without warning, he grabbed Marcus's arm and spun him around, forcing him to place his hands on the hood of the car. Hey, Marcus protested, startled by the sudden movement. What's going on? I haven't done anything wrong. Oh, you haven't, huh? Collins shot back, his voice rising. Then why are you acting so nervous? Why won't you answer my question straight? Marcus gritted his teeth, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. He wasn't nervous. He was annoyed. Annoyed at being treated like a criminal. Annoyed at having his integrity questioned. And most of all, annoyed at the blatant disregard for basic human decency. But he forced himself to take a deep breath, reminding himself that losing his temper wouldn't help. Not now. As Collins began, patting him down, Marcus glanced toward the patrol car parked behind his sedan. Its headlights illuminated the scene, casting long shadows across the road. In the distance, he noticed another set of flashing lights approaching, a second police vehicle pulling up to assist. For a moment, Marcus felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this newcomer would see the absurdity of the situation and intervene. Maybe they'd realize that Collins was letting his biases cloud his judgment. When the second officer stepped out of their car, Marcus studied them closely. They were younger than Collins, probably newer to the force, with a cautious look in their eyes. They approached the scene slowly, observing the interaction between Marcus and Collins with visible unease. What's going on here, Derek? The younger officer asked, addressing Collins by his first name. Their tone was polite but firm, suggesting they weren't entirely convinced by Collins's behavior. This guy was speeding, Collins snapped, not looking away from Marcus, and he's refusing to cooperate. That's not true, Marcus interjected quickly, turning his head slightly to address the new arrival. I've been cooperative from the start. I even handed over my license and registration without argument. Officer Collins seems to have made some assumptions about me based on, well, I'm not sure what. The younger officer frowned, glancing between Marcus and Collins. There was a brief pause, filled only by the hum of the idling patrol cars and the distant chirping of crickets. Finally, the younger officer spoke again. Did you run his plates? Check for warrants? Collins hesitated, clearly annoyed at being questioned. Not yet, he admitted gruffly. But I know what I saw. This guy was speeding, plain and simple. The younger officers sighed, shaking their heads slightly. We should at least verify everything before we jump to conclusions, they said, their tone measured but firm. Protocol exists for a reason. Marcus felt a small surge of relief. At least someone was willing to follow procedure rather than rely on gut feelings, or worse, prejudice. He watched as the younger officer walked back to their patrol car, presumably to run his information through the system. Meanwhile, Collins continued his search, his movements brusque and unnecessary. When he finally finished, he stepped back and crossed his arms, glaring at Marcus like he expected him to make a run for it. After what felt like an eternity, the younger officer returned, holding a clipboard. Their expression had shifted slightly. It was harder to read now, but there was definitely a hint of discomfort. Derek, they began hesitantly, glancing at Marcus before lowering their voice. This guy, he's clean. No priors, no outstanding warrants. Everything checks. Out. Collins scowled, clearly displeased. That doesn't prove he wasn't speeding, he muttered defensively. Just because he hasn't broken the law before doesn't mean he didn't tonight. The younger officer nodded slowly, clearly torn. True, but maybe we should reconsider escalating this. If he's not resisting and there's no concrete evidence. Are you questioning my call? Collins interrupted sharply, his voice rising. Because if you are, you can go ahead and write yourself up for insubordination. The younger officer flinched but didn't back down entirely. I'm just saying we should stick to the facts, that's all. Marcus watched the exchange silently, feeling a mix of emotions. On one hand, he appreciated the younger officer's attempt to de-escalate the situation. On the other hand, he couldn't help but feel frustrated at how much effort it took to get even a shred of fairness. This wasn't just about him. It was about every person who'd ever been treated unfairly because of the color of their skin, their clothes, or their car. It was about systemic issues that went far beyond one bad cop. Finally, after what felt like forever, Collins relented. Not because he believed Marcus was innocent, but because he didn't want to deal with the hassle of explaining his actions later. With a heavy sigh, he uncuffed Marcus and handed back his belongings. Consider yourself lucky, he growled, stepping aside to let Marcus return to his car. Next time, don't speed. Marcus didn't respond. He simply got back into his sedan, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly as he tried to process everything that had just happened. As he drove away, he caught sight of Collins in his rearview mirror, still standing on the side of the road, watching him leave. Little did Collins know this encounter was far from over, and when the truth came out, it would change both their lives forever. Marcus's hands were still trembling slightly as he pulled into the driveway of his home. The quiet suburban street offered no solace. The weight of what had just happened pressed heavily on his chest. He sat in his car for a moment, staring at the steering wheel, replaying the events in his mind. It wasn't the first time he'd been treated unfairly, but tonight felt different, sharper, more personal. Collins hadn't just profiled him. He'd gone out of his way to humiliate and intimidate him, all based on assumptions that had nothing to do with reality. As Marcus stepped out of the car, he glanced at his watch. It was nearly 11 p.m., and the house was dark except for the soft glow of the porch light. His wife Lisa would be asleep by now, but he knew he wouldn't find rest anytime soon. Instead, he walked inside, poured himself a glass of water, and sat down at the kitchen table. For a while, he simply stared into space, trying to decide what to do next. The logical part of him said to let it go. After all, he'd been released without charges and no real harm had come to him. But another part, the part that had spent years fighting for justice within the system, knew this couldn't be ignored. What if Collins treated someone else the same way? Someone who didn't have the resources or resilience to push back? Marcus couldn't shake the image of the younger officer hesitating, torn between following protocol and deferring to Collins' authority. That hesitation spoke volumes about the culture within the department, and Marcus knew it needed to change. With a deep breath, Marcus picked up his phone and dialed a number he knew by heart. Lieutenant Harris answered on the second ring, his voice groggy but alert. Marcus, everything okay? I need to talk, Marcus said simply, cutting straight to the point. Can you meet me at the station tomorrow morning? Early. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Harris knew Marcus well enough to recognize when something serious was going on. Of course, he replied. What's this about? I'll explain everything then, Marcus said. Just trust me. This is important. When Marcus arrived at the station the following morning, the sun was just beginning to rise, casting long shadows across the parking lot. Harris was already waiting for him, standing near the entrance with a cup of coffee in hand. He greeted Marcus with a concerned nod, motioning for him to follow him inside. Once they were seated in Harris's office, a small, cluttered room filled with stacks of paperwork and framed commendations, Marcus recounted the entire incident. He described how Collins had pulled him over, accused him of speeding without evidence, and subjected him to an unnecessary search. He explained how Collins's comments had crossed the line from professional to deeply disrespectful, fueled by prejudice rather than facts. Harris listened intently, his expression growing darker with each detail. When Marcus finished, there was a long silence. Finally, Harris leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "This isn't good," he muttered. "Not good at all." "No kidding," Marcus replied, his voice tight with frustration. "But here's the kicker. You know who I am, right? You know what I do for a living?" Harris nodded slowly. "You're the head of internal affairs, one of the highest-ranking officials in the department." "Exactly," Marcus said, leaning forward. "And yet Collins treated me like I was some random guy off the street. He didn't even bother running my plates until the other officer insisted. Do you see the problem here? If he can treat me this way, imagine what happens to people who don't have my title or my connections." Harris sighed, clearly troubled. "I get it, Marcus. Believe me, I do. But you know how these things work. Officers like Collins, they're stubborn, defensive. They won't admit they're wrong, especially not to someone like you. That's exactly why we can't let this slide." Marcus shot back, his tone firm. "If we don't hold him accountable, what message does that send? That it's okay to abuse your power as long as you don't get caught? We've got a responsibility to fix this, not just for me, but for everyone who depends on us to protect them." Harris nodded reluctantly. "All right, so what's the plan?" Marcus reached into his briefcase and pulled out a folder containing copies of his driver's license, registration, and the notes he'd jotted down after the encounter. "First, we review the dashcam footage. If Collins recorded any of it, and he should have, we'll see exactly how far he went. Then we bring him in for questioning, let him explain himself." Harris frowned. "You realize this could get messy, right? People are going to take sides, start rumors." "I'm counting on it," Marcus interrupted, his jaw set with determination. "Let them talk. The truth will come out, and when it does, it'll force everyone to confront the bigger issues at play. This isn't just about one bad cop. It's about a pattern of behavior that's been allowed to fester for too long." By mid-morning, word of Marcus's complaint had spread through the station like wildfire. Officers whispered in hallways, speculating about what had happened and whose side they should take. Some expressed sympathy for Marcus, acknowledging that Collins had a reputation for being difficult. Others dismissed the allegations, claiming Marcus must have done something to provoke him. A few even joked that Marcus was using his position to settle a personal score, unaware of how hypocritical their comments sounded. Meanwhile, Collins remained oblivious to the storm brewing around him. When he reported for his shift later that afternoon, he was surprised to find Harris waiting for him outside the locker room. "We need to talk," Harris said curtly, gesturing for Collins to follow him. Collins frowned, sensing trouble but refusing to show it. "About what?" he asked, feigning nonchalance. "You'll see," Harris replied, leading him to a private meeting room. Inside, Marcus was already seated, his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. Collins froze for a split second before masking his surprise with a sneer. "Oh, great," he muttered sarcastically. "What's this about? Another lecture on policy reform?" Marcus ignored the jab, focusing instead on maintaining his composure. "Have a seat, Officer Collins," he said calmly. "We're going to review the events of last night." Collins hesitated but eventually complied, sinking into the chair, across from Marcus. Harris stood nearby, acting as both mediator and witness. "All right," Collins said, crossing his arms defensively. "Let's hear it. What's your version of events?" For the next hour, Marcus laid out his case piece by piece. He presented the timeline of the traffic stop, highlighted key moments where Collins's actions deviated from standard procedure, and played excerpts from the dashcam footage. The video was damning. Collins's aggressive tone, His refusal to listen to reason, and his thinly veiled racist remarks were all captured in crystal-clear audio. As the playback ended, Collins shifted, uncomfortably in his chair, his bravado faltering. "So what?" he snapped, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "Maybe I came on strong, but that doesn't mean I did anything wrong. The guy was speeding. I know what I saw." "That's not what the speed check says, Harris," interjected, sliding a printout across the table. "According to the data, Mr. Thompson was driving 5 miles under the limit when you pulled him over." Collins stared at the paper, his face reddening with anger, or maybe embarrassment. "Fine. Maybe I misjudged the speed," he admitted grudgingly, "but that doesn't excuse the rest of it. He was acting suspicious, refusing to answer my questions directly. What was I supposed to think?" "You were supposed to follow protocol," Marcus countered, his voice steady but sharp. "Instead, you let your biases dictate your actions. You assumed I was guilty because of how I look, not because of any actual evidence. And that's unacceptable." Collins opened his mouth to argue, but stopped short when Harris raised a hand. "Enough," Harris said firmly. "This isn't up for debate. Your conduct last night violated multiple policies, and it's going to be investigated thoroughly. Until then, you're on administrative leave." Collins shot to his feet, his face contorted with rage. "You've got to be kidding me. This is ridiculous. You're making an example out of me because of who he is." He pointed accusingly at Marcus, who remained unfazed. "It's not about who I am," Marcus said quietly. "It's about what you did. And whether you admit it or not, your actions last night hurt more than just me. They undermined public trust in this department. So yes, there will be consequences." As Collins stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him, Marcus leaned back in his chair, exhaling deeply. The battle was far from over, but at least the first step had been taken. Holding individuals accountable was only part of the solution. The real challenge lay in changing the culture that allowed such behavior to thrive in the first place, and Marcus was determined to see it through, no matter how long it took. The following days were a whirlwind of activity both inside and outside the police department. Word of Marcus's confrontation with Officer Collins spread quickly, not just among officers but also to local news outlets. Reporters sniffed out the story, drawn by the dramatic irony of a high-ranking official being mistreated during a routine traffic stop. By midweek, headlines blared across newspapers and TV segments. "Head of Internal Affairs pulled over in controversial stop," and officer suspended after altercation with top cop. For Marcus, the media attention was both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, it amplified his message, shining a spotlight on systemic issues within law enforcement. On the other hand, it opened him up to scrutiny from critics who accused him of using his position for personal vendettas. Social media buzzed with heated debates, some praising Marcus as a champion of accountability, while others dismissed him as someone playing victimhood politics. Despite the noise, Marcus remained focused. He called an emergency meeting with the police chief, Lieutenant Harris, and members of the oversight committee. The room was tense as everyone took their seats around the conference table. Papers shuffled, pens clicked nervously, and coffee cups steamed quietly. Marcus stood at the head of the table, his posture commanding yet composed. This wasn't about revenge, it was about justice. "Thank you all for coming," Marcus began, his voice calm but firm. "We're here today because what happened last week isn't just about one officer or one incident. It's about a pattern of behavior that undermines public trust, and if we don't address it now, it will continue to erode the integrity of this department." He pressed play on a laptop, connected to a projector screen. The room fell silent as footage from Collins' dash cam filled the wall. Every word, every gesture was laid bare for everyone to see. The audio captured Collins's dismissive tone, his refusal to listen to reason, and his thinly veiled racist remarks. When the clip ended, no one spoke immediately. Some shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Others exchanged uneasy glances. "This is unacceptable," Marcus continued, turning off the projector. "Not only did Officer Collins violate multiple policies, but he did so while representing this department. His actions reflect poorly on all of us. We owe it to the community, and to ourselves, to hold him accountable." The police chief nodded solemnly. "I agree," she said, her voice heavy with authority. "But let's be clear, this isn't just about punishing one bad apple. It's about identifying where things went wrong and ensuring it doesn't happen again." Lieutenant Harris chimed in, adding, "We need transparency moving forward. That means reviewing training protocols, addressing implicit bias, and holding regular workshops on de-escalation techniques. If we want to rebuild trust, we have to start from within." Collins was summoned to the meeting shortly afterward. His entrance was anything but humble. He strode into the room with clenched fists and a defiant scowl, refusing to make eye contact with anyone. When instructed to take a seat, he complied reluctantly, slouching in his chair like a teenager forced to attend detention. Marcus wasted no time getting to the point. "Officer Collins, you've been suspended pending further investigation into your conduct during the traffic stop involving me. Do you understand why?" Collins scoffed, rolling his eyes. "Yeah, I understand all right. I'm being made an example of because of who you are. None of this would have blown up if it had been some random guy instead of the big boss." Marcus leaned forward slightly, his gaze steady. "That's exactly my point. If it had been some random guy, they wouldn't have had the resources or platform to fight back. They'd have walked away feeling powerless, maybe even afraid to report you. Would that have been okay with you? Is that the kind of officer you want to be?" Collins opened his mouth to argue but hesitated. For a brief moment, doubt flickered across his face, though he quickly masked it with indignation. "Look, I admit I might have overreacted, but I wasn't doing anything illegal. You can't punish me for making a judgment call." "A judgment call based on prejudice," Marcus corrected sharply. "You assumed I was guilty before gathering any evidence. You searched me without probable cause. You treated me like a criminal. Because of how I look, not because of what I did. That's not a judgment call, that's misconduct." The room grew quieter, the weight of Marcus's words sinking in. Even Collins seemed to realize he was fighting a losing battle. Still, he wasn't ready to surrender. "Fine, maybe I messed up, but come on. You really expect me to believe this whole thing isn't personal? You're using your fancy title to throw your weight around." Marcus sighed, his expression softening slightly. "This isn't personal, Officer Collins. It's professional. My job is to ensure fairness and accountability within this department. If I ignored what happened to me, I'd be failing at my duty. And frankly, I think you know that." Collins didn't respond right away. Instead, he stared down at the table, his jaw working silently as if wrestling with something internally. Finally, he muttered, "Whatever. Do what you gotta do." With that, the meeting adjourned. Collins left the room looking defeated, his bravado replaced by simmering resentment. As the door closed behind him, the group turned their focus to the next steps. Policies needed updating, training programs required revision, and communication channels between officers and citizens had to improve. Marcus outlined a plan to implement these changes systematically, emphasizing the importance of collaboration rather than punishment. Later that evening, Marcus sat alone in his office, reflecting on the day's events. Despite the progress made, he couldn't shake the image of Collins's angry face. There was anger there, yes, but also fear. A fear of change, of losing control, of being exposed for flaws he refused to acknowledge. Marcus knew that true transformation wouldn't come easily. People like Collins weren't going to wake up overnight and suddenly embrace equality or empathy. It would take time, effort, and patience. Still, Marcus felt a spark of hope. Change always started small, like a crack in a dam. Once the first trickle broke through, the floodgates could open wide. He thought about the younger officer who had intervened during the traffic stop, the one who had questioned Collins's methods despite the risk of backlash. Officers like that gave him faith that the department wasn't beyond saving. They reminded him that even in the darkest corners, light could still find its way in. As he packed up his belongings and prepared to leave for the night, Marcus glanced at the framed photo on his desk. It was a picture of him and Lisa at a community event, smiling alongside neighbors and colleagues. At the heart of everything he fought for was the belief that safety and justice should belong to everyone, not just those fortunate enough to avoid prejudice. With renewed determination, Marcus resolved to keep pushing forward, no matter how long the road ahead might be. The days following the emergency meeting at the police department were a turning point, not just for Marcus and Officer Collins, but for the entire organization. The ripple effects of the incident spread far beyond the confines of the station, sparking conversations that had long been avoided. For many officers, it was a wake-up call. For others, it was a source of resentment. And for Marcus, it was an opportunity to push for meaningful change. By the end of the week, the department announced sweeping reforms aimed at addressing systemic issues like racial profiling, implicit bias, and excessive use of authority. Training sessions on cultural sensitivity became mandatory for all personnel, from rookies fresh out of the academy to seasoned veterans with decades of experience. New policies were introduced requiring officers to document every traffic stop in detail, including the reasons for pulling someone over and any actions taken during the encounter. Body cameras, which had previously been optional in certain situations, were now required to be worn at all times while on duty. These changes didn't sit well with everyone. Some officers grumbled about unnecessary bureaucracy or complained that they were being treated like criminals themselves. Others argued that the reforms would make their jobs harder, forcing them to second-guess every decision. But Marcus stood firm, reminding his colleagues that accountability wasn't about punishment. It was about building trust. "You joined this force because you wanted to serve and protect," he told a group of skeptical officers during one training session. "But how can people trust us if we don't hold ourselves to the highest standards? These policies aren't here to punish you. They're here to help you do your job better." Not everyone listened, but some did. Slowly but surely, attitudes began to shift. Younger officers in particular seemed more open to the idea of reform. Many had grown up in a world where social justice movements dominated headlines, and they understood the importance of adapting to changing times. One rookie even approached Marcus after a workshop to thank him for speaking so candidly. "I've seen how things can go wrong when we don't think before we act," the young officer admitted. "It's good to know there are people like you looking out for us and for the community." Meanwhile, Officer Collins's situation continued to unravel. After weeks of investigation, an internal review board concluded that his behavior during the traffic stop constituted misconduct. He was formally charged with violating departmental policies and suspended without pay. Though he appealed the decision, claiming he was being unfairly targeted, his arguments fell flat. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and public opinion wasn't exactly on his side. Stripped of his badge and uniform, Collins struggled to adjust to life outside the force. Without the structure and identity that came with being a police officer, he felt lost. His once boisterous demeanor gave way to bitterness, and his relationship suffered as a result. Friends stopped calling, and family members grew tired of hearing him complain about how unfairly he'd been treated. Even his wife hinted that maybe he should consider therapy, a suggestion Collins initially dismissed as nonsense. But over time, something unexpected happened. As the initial shock wore off and reality set in, Collins began to reflect on his actions, or lack thereof. At first it was subtle, a fleeting thought during a sleepless night, a pang of guilt when passing by a patrol car. Then came the day. He received a letter from the department offering him the chance to attend counseling sessions as part of his rehabilitation process. It wasn't mandatory, but it was strongly encouraged. At first, Collins resisted. Therapy felt like admitting weakness, like conceding that he'd been wrong all along. But eventually, pride gave way to curiosity, or perhaps desperation. He scheduled an appointment with Dr. Elena Martinez, a psychologist who specialized in working with law enforcement professionals. Their first session was awkward, filled with long silences and defensive answers. But Dr. Martinez was patient, asking thoughtful questions that forced Collins to confront uncomfortable truths. "Why do you think you reacted the way you did that night?" she asked during one particularly tense session. Collins shrugged, avoiding eye contact. I don't know. Maybe I got carried away. Happens to everyone, right? Maybe, Dr. Martinez replied gently. But let's dig deeper. What assumptions were you making about Mr. Thompson before you even spoke to him? Collins hesitated, his fingers tapping nervously on the armrest of his chair. I guess I assumed he was trouble. You know, fancy car, suit and tie. He looked like someone who thought he was better than me. And how did that assumption affect your behavior? I don't know, Collins muttered, his voice tinged with frustration. It pissed me off, okay? Like, who does he think he is? Dr. Martinez nodded slowly. So your anger wasn't really about him speeding. It was about how he made you feel. Collins frowned, mulling over her words. For years, he'd prided himself on being tough, on never backing down. But now, sitting in this quiet office with its soft lighting and neutral tones, he realized how much of his career had been driven by fear. Fear of losing control, fear of looking weak, fear of being judged. Maybe Marcus hadn't been the problem that night. Maybe the problem had been staring back at him in the mirror all along. Back at the department, Marcus continued to lead by example. He worked tirelessly to implement the new policies, often staying late into the night to ensure everything ran smoothly. He held town hall meetings with community members, listening to their concerns and promising to address them. He partnered with local organizations to host workshops on bridging the gap between law enforcement and the neighborhoods they served. Slowly but surely, trust began to rebuild. One evening, after a particularly productive meeting, Marcus found himself walking through the empty halls of the station. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead, casting long shadows across the tiled floor. As he passed Lieutenant Harris's office, he noticed the door was slightly ajar. Peering inside, he saw Harris seated at his desk, poring over paperwork. Still, burning the midnight oil, huh? Marcus joked, leaning against the doorway. Harris looked up and smiled wearily. Somebody's got to keep this place running. Besides, it's easier to get work done when no one's around to interrupt. Marcus chuckled, stepping inside. You know, sometimes I wonder if all this effort is worth it. There are days when it feels like we're fighting an uphill battle. Harris leaned back in his chair, studying Marcus thoughtfully. You ever hear the story about the starfish? The what? It's an old tale, Harris explained. A guy walks along the beach after a storm and sees thousands of starfish washed ashore. Another man is throwing them back into the ocean one by one. The first guy says, "What difference does it make? There are too many to save." And the second guy picks up another starfish, tosses it into the water, and says, "It made a difference to that one." Marcus smiled faintly, touched by the analogy. I guess you're saying I'm the guy, throwing starfish back? Harris grinned. Exactly. Every policy change, every conversation, every moment of accountability, it matters. Even if it doesn't fix everything overnight, it's still progress. As Marcus left the station that night, he couldn't help but feel a renewed sense of purpose. Change wouldn't happen overnight, and not everyone would embrace it willingly. But as long as there were people willing to throw starfish back into the ocean, hope remained alive. And for Marcus, that was enough. Months had passed since the night of the traffic stop, and life in the police department and the community it served had undergone significant changes. The reforms Marcus pushed for were starting to take root, though progress was slow and uneven. Some officers embraced the new policies with enthusiasm, while others dragged their feet, grumbling about political correctness or claiming that the changes made their jobs harder. But amidst the pushback, there were glimmers of hope. Fewer complaints from citizens, more open dialogue between officers and residents, and a growing sense of accountability within the ranks. Marcus stood on stage at a packed community forum, his presence commanding yet approachable. The room buzzed with energy as people filed in, eager to hear what he had to say. Parents with young children sat alongside elderly neighbors. Activists shared space with retired officers, and local journalists scribbled notes in anticipation of his speech. It was a diverse crowd, united by a shared desire for justice and understanding. As Marcus adjusted the microphone and scanned the audience, he felt a mix of emotions: pride in how far they'd come, determination to keep pushing forward, and humility at the knowledge that the work was far from over. He cleared his throat and began to speak. "Thank you all for being here tonight," he said, his voice warm and steady. "This isn't just another meeting, it's a conversation, a chance for us to reflect on where we've been, celebrate what we've achieved, and acknowledge the challenges still ahead." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "When I first joined this department, I believed deeply in its mission to protect and serve. Over time, however, I've come to realize that protecting and serving means more than enforcing laws. It means earning trust. Trust doesn't happen overnight. It's built through actions, not words. And sometimes, it requires facing uncomfortable truths." The audience listened intently as Marcus recounted the events of that fateful traffic stop, the humiliation, the anger, the frustration. Not as a story of personal triumph, but as a call to action. He spoke candidly about the biases embedded in the system and the harm they caused, emphasizing that change required effort from everyone, not just those in uniform. "This isn't about pointing fingers or assigning blame," he continued. "It's about recognizing our shared humanity. Every person deserves to feel safe in their own community, regardless of the color of their skin, the car they drive, or the clothes they wear. That's the world I'm fighting for, a world where no one has to wonder if they'll be treated fairly when they encounter law enforcement." His words resonated deeply, drawing murmurs of agreement from the crowd. When he finished speaking, the room erupted into applause, with several attendees rising to their feet. As Marcus stepped off the stage, he was met with handshakes, hugs, and heartfelt thanks. For many in the audience, his message wasn't just inspiring, it was empowering. It reminded them that change was possible, even in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. Meanwhile, Officer Collins' journey toward redemption was quieter, but no less significant. After months of therapy, he began to confront the prejudices and insecurities that had shaped his behavior. Dr. Martinez encouraged him to explore why he reacted so strongly to certain triggers, helping him recognize patterns of thought that led to poor decisions. Slowly, Collins started to see himself and others in a different light. One day, during a particularly candid session, Collins admitted something he'd never dared to say aloud. "I guess I always thought being tough meant never backing down. Like if I showed any weakness, people would walk all over me. But now I realize, maybe toughness isn't about control. Maybe it's about owning up to your mistakes." Dr. Martinez smiled warmly. "That's a big step, Derek. Accountability takes courage. You're stronger than you think." Encouraged by her words, Collins decided to take a proactive role in rebuilding his life. He enrolled in a security training program and eventually landed a job as a mall guard. It wasn't glamorous work, but it gave him a fresh start. Interacting with shoppers, store owners, and employees forced him to practice patience and empathy, skills he hadn't fully developed during his time on the force. Over time, Collins noticed subtle shifts in his perspective. He found himself offering assistance to customers who seemed lost or upset, rather than jumping to conclusions about their intentions. He learned to listen without judgment, to observe without assuming. Though he still struggled with moments of doubt and regret, he recognized that growth was a process, not an endpoint. Back at the police station, Marcus reflected on the impact of the past year. The department was far from perfect, but the culture was shifting. Officers who once dismissed him as a figurehead now sought his guidance, realizing that his commitment to reform stemmed from genuine care for both the badge and the community. Community members, too, were beginning to view the police as partners rather than adversaries. One evening, as Marcus prepared to leave the office, he received an unexpected visitor, Lieutenant Harris. Holding 2 cups of coffee, Harris gestured toward the empty conference room. "Got a minute?" Curious, Marcus followed him inside. They sat across from each other, sipping their drinks in companionable silence before Harris broke the ice. "You know, I've been thinking about something. All the work you've done, do you ever feel like it's enough?" Marcus chuckled softly. If I waited until it felt like enough, I'd never stop working. Progress is incremental, and setbacks are inevitable, but every step forward counts. Harris nodded thoughtfully. Still, you deserve credit for sticking with it. Not everyone would have the guts or the patience to see this through. Marcus leaned back in his chair, considering the compliment. It's not about me, he said finally. It's about the people we serve. If even one person feels safer because of the changes we've made, then it's worth it. They talked for a while longer, reminiscing about the highs and lows of the past year. When Harris left, Marcus lingered in the quiet room, staring out the window at the city skyline. The lights twinkled like stars against the darkening sky, a reminder of the countless lives affected by the choices made within these walls. As he drove home that night, Marcus replayed the events of the forum in his mind. He thought about the faces in the audience, the parents holding their children's hands, the activists clutching signs, the officers sitting quietly in the back row. Each one represented a thread in the fabric of the community, woven together by shared struggles and aspirations. And then he thought about Collins, not the angry defensive man he'd encountered that night on the roadside, but the humbled individual, trying to rebuild his life. Redemption wasn't guaranteed, but the possibility existed, and that was something worth believing in. Pulling into his driveway, Marcus turned off the engine and sat for a moment, letting the silence wash over him. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to make a difference, but for now he allowed himself to feel a quiet sense of satisfaction. Change was hard, messy, and often painful, but it was also beautiful, and as long as there were people willing to fight for it, hope would endure. With a deep breath, Marcus stepped out of the car and walked toward the house, ready to rest, recharge, and rise again to continue the journey.